I'm recording this last lecture ahead of time for you to watch before our meeting on Wednesday because we have 4 people giving their presentations in 3 hours, and I wanted to give you all plenty of time to talk about your projects. For my last lecture, I will review some of the concepts that we've gone over already regarding how chance is related to creativity, adaptation, and learning. How is anything radically new ever created in nature? Is it true, as some scientists say, that everything under the sun is just a different arrangement of the same old materials that have existed since the dawn of the universe? Are poems just different permutations of ideas that have been expressed time and time again? I'm going to try to answer that question by talking about Nabokov's process of creation using strange coincidences. This week you read the short story by Nabokov called The Bane Sisters, written in 1959, in which a once-mentioned character, an eccentric librarian named Porlock, decides to search through old books looking for typos that might transform a sentence into one with an entirely new and different meaning. The chance that mimics choice, the flaw that looks like a flower. Porlock's friend, Cynthia Vane, suspects that apparently chance typos might actually be messages from ghosts. She's very superstitious. In the story, she holds seances and pretends to speak with the dead who make knocking sounds that she can decipher. Occasionally, Nabokov liked to toy with the idea of the supernatural, possibly because an author is like a god of his own creation. According to the events as literally depicted in the Bane Sisters, nothing supernatural happens. However, the astute or superstitious reader may find the hidden acrostic in the last few lines of the story. As I mentioned earlier, the lines stand out from the rest of the story because they are so awkwardly written. So there's a flaw that stands out. Compare that to the flaw that looks like a flower and the mention of flaw previously, and there's going to be another mention of the word flaw. This is the narrator of the story taking a moment to reflect on the dream he had had the night before, trying to interpret it as a message from Cynthia. I could isolate consciously little. Everything seemed blurred, yellow clouded, yielding nothing tangible. Her inept acrostics, maudlin evasions, theopathies. Every recollection formed ripples of mysterious meaning. Everything seemed yellowly blurred, elusive, lost. So the first letter of each word here spells out the following message. Icicles by Cynthia, meter by me, Sybil. If you remember at the beginning of the story, the narrator became distracted by some pretty icicles dripping water, and he had strayed down a street looking at more pretty icicles and other scenery, until he coincidentally ran into an old friend who tells him that Cynthia has died. And the story starts with the narrator recalling his friendships with Sybil and Cynthia. The fact that there is this secret message in the text proves to the reader that there is an all-knowing entity above and beyond the reality of the narrative who can hide meta-narrative clues to make the reader suspect his existence. I'll note that early biblical scholars, Jewish and early Christian scholars, regularly interpreted random details and numbers in holy texts as having some other meaning. There is a whole tradition of numerology associated with holy texts. I only mention this in passing, but I think these kinds of traditions were probably carried over to poetry and literary works, such as this short story, that can invite crazy interpretations. There's a fascinating book called Early Biblical Interpretations by James Kugel and Rowan Greer on this topic. In various other places in this story, the Bane Sisters, the river is expected to understand crossword-like clues, references to the river Alf, which appears in Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan, and Anna Livia Pluribel, which is a character in a late work by James Joyce. James Joyce's publisher, incidentally, is named Sylvia Beach. The narrator, after learning that Cynthia is dead, he tries to sleep that night, and every little creak and knock scares him as if Cynthia might be trying to communicate with him. He doesn't really believe this, but nevertheless, he's going to sleep. It's dark, it's late. The narrator recalls a number of historical instances of people who claim to have had encounters with dead spirits. The Fox sisters are mentioned. I had to look that up. This is a story that is actually recorded in the papers in the mid-1800s. A family in upstate New York heard strange knocking sounds, and they figured out that they could communicate with this ghost and ask it questions. And the ghost could correctly give the age of everyone in the house by knocking. They called dozens of neighbors over, and the ghost could correctly give all their ages too. It was sort of this neighborhood phenomenon. They managed to find out from the ghost that he had been killed in the house many years before and buried in the cellar. Some number of years later, a skeleton was discovered buried in the cellar. And this gives some credibility to the events, which took place on April 1st, April Fool's Day. A spiritual movement started in New York as a result, and in Massachusetts. And when I was looking this up, I found they still exist and they have regular meetings. William James actually studied this phenomenon at the time. So now I ask, what are the chances that any house in upstate New York has a body buried in the cellar? Actually, it might not be that unusual. If someone dies in the winter, ground outside is frozen, and it was custom to temporarily bury someone in the cellar with the intention of digging them up in the spring for a proper reburial. And 3 or 4 months later, who wants to dig up a decaying body of a loved one? So, for this week, you also read Percy Diaconis' method of studying coincidences. His co-author is Mosteller. We can use statistics to explain why some patterns seem to be incredible, but in fact, they are not improbable at all. He discusses the effect of very large numbers. For example, if there are millions of people buying lottery tickets every week, there is a 50-50 chance that every 7 years or so, one person will win the lottery twice. In a group of 23 people, there's a 50% chance that 2 will share a birthday. And in a group of 48 people, there is a 95% chance. Nabokov, Shakespeare, and Bruce Clark, whose work on von Forster we read recently, share the birthday the 23rd of April. Shakespeare also died on the 23rd of April. Actually, we don't know for sure Shakespeare's actual birthday, but we guess it's the 23rd because 3 days later he was baptized and his birth was registered. Historians will give his birthday as the 23rd because it's an interesting pattern. Bruce Clark edited something I wrote about Diaconis' analysis of the birthday problem once. And in that writing, I chose at random the birthday, the 23rd of April, as an example. I figured my literary readers would get the clue pointing to Shakespeare or Nabokov, but Clark thought I meant to signal his birthday. Diaconis also offers ways of analyzing the probability that if you learn a new rare word, that you will randomly encounter that word again within what seems to be a brief period of time. Diaconis gives us examples of a case where we know there's a significant pattern, but we can't prove it quantitatively. For example, we know that Shakespeare frequently used alliteration to convey certain meanings or tone. But if you do a statistical analysis of his sonnets, depending on how you count the data, it can be hard to prove quantitatively what seems simply obvious. Did Shakespeare use alliteration when he wrote poetry? This question shocks our friends, many of whom respond with scornful looks and lines like, "Full fathom 5, thy father lies." The psychologist B.F. Skinner analyzed this question by looking at Shakespeare's sonnets and counting how many times the same sound occurs in a line. He compared such coincidences with a binomial null hypothesis. You take the number of letters that are available and the number of letters that are in the line itself, and you would get the probability of there being a repetition of one of those 26 letters. So the two different categories are what's expected given probability and what you actually observe. Consider the sound S as it appears in the lines of the sonnets. Table 1 shows the frequency distribution of the number of S sounds in lines of Shakespeare's sonnets. The parentheses give counts Skinner obtained when the same word in a line is not counted more than once. After comparing the observed and expected accounts, Skinner concluded that although Shakespeare may alliterate on purpose, the evidence is that binomial chance would handle these observations. He says, so far as this aspect of poetry is concerned, Shakespeare might as well have drawn his words out of a hat. Diaconis goes on to say, in this problem, the noise clearly overwhelms any signal. We find it refreshing to be reminded sometimes that things that we all know must be true can be very hard to prove. Of course, Skinner must have set up this statistical analysis incorrectly on purpose to show how to do poor analysis of statistics. Think about how he should have set it up. Of course, you don't count the relative frequency of all the sounds. You locate the ones that you think are significant, and you only analyze those lines. If Skinner had analyzed an entire poem like Beowulf, which is alliterative verse, he would have found an unusually high number of repeated sounds. If you are doing a quantitative analysis for your project, make sure that you're counting the right things, using appropriately large or focused samples, or explain what the appropriate method would be to take if you were to do such a study. Does Diaconis' statistical approach to coincidences seem to take all the fun out of them for you? Skinner is notorious for reducing everything interesting we do to reward and punishment training. He trained pigeons to do all sorts of tricks. I may have mentioned previously Skinner's experiment where he randomly gave pigeons a food pellet and the pigeon would repeat whatever it had been doing at that time, thinking the action was correlated with the reward. After a while, he ended up with a bunch of pigeons doing a lot of wacky behaviors to get food. And Skinner called this superstitious behavior. Think of all the people who have weird rituals that they do to prevent bad luck or whatever. Diaconis is not a boring numbers guy like Skinner. I think I may have mentioned before that he is a magician as well as a statistician. You can tell that he likes magic by the way he treats coincidence. While Diaconis offers a quantitative method for studying coincidences, we will use Nabokov to understand a qualitative use of coincidences. I really enjoy both approaches. Following Diaconis feels like solving a puzzle by working out how what seems like a freak occurrence is really ordinary. And for Nabokov, coincidences are literally puzzles. I like to argue that coincidences are part of a mechanism that allows truly new things to come into the world. Like Barbieri's adapter that we discussed in the code biology unit. Coincidences bring two unrelated things together. So to answer the question I posed at the beginning of this lecture, yes, authors can create new things in words, and inventors can invent new things. During this course, we have talked about deterministic chaos, self-organization, artificial life, and the complexity sciences, new scientific concepts and tools that can be used to re-examine the question of whether or not genuine novelty can emerge, almost like a miracle from the rearrangement of already existing parts. This new science has renovated the Newtonian paradigm. Complexity scientists say that effectual factors in nonlinear, that is, complex systems, allow a system to self-organize, become complex and unpredictable. It's been my argument that these effectual factors are the qualities of relationships between physical things that can't be quantified very easily. Similarity is analog and relative, so is proximity. How near and how like something is to something else may affect the probability of a new relationship crystallizing. We examined that last week in the Origin of Life unit. We can say that effectual factors are the literary puns and suggestive chance patterns of physics and biology. For example, imagine how a moth, which happens to be resting on a tree trunk of similar color to itself, inadvertently furthers its own chances of survival. To a bird cruising by, the dull moth looks like bark. These are points at which the strict determinist, like a Pierre Laplace or a Daniel Dennett, will see predictable trajectories of matter and energy take an unpredictably sharp turn. Every artist I've ever known describes the creative process in a similar fashion. But much less obvious is the kind of creative interpretation that goes on in nature even when there is no intelligent animal to interpret the coincidence. As you know by now, this is where biosemiotics comes in, studying the mysteriously meaningful lives of biological cells. For example, the wrong molecule may happen to fit into a cell receptor because of a similar shape to the right molecule, and this can cause a chain of reactions that repurpose that receptor for some other function. Chance that mimics choice. All living systems tend to interpret coincidences, and this is how they get their power of self-organization, how they hold themselves together better than you'd think possible, how they come to function in advantageous ways far beyond what the numbers might predict. All semiosis, that is, purposeful, self-confirming habits that characterize all living things, always begins with the radically transformative process of poiesis. Every new semiotic habit, that is, rule-bound biological process, must begin as a mistaken interpretation of a coincidental pattern. Adaptation always involves a typo, a mutation, an error that gets mistaken for something else. This must be so, for the only way a living system has to respond to anything foreign and new is to mistake it for something it does know, assimilate it into itself, and allow it to change itself. Every new sign must be meaningful to a system of interpretation that can connect with it and use it. This adds a radically new dimension to Darwin's theory. This reestablishes a notion of agency, the idea that an organism has some control over evolutionary adaptation. It's not just random change with natural selection. Coincidentally meaningful mistakes are not quite random. They are constrained by similarity and proximity and the agent's past history. We know that human language must emerge somehow from biological processes, and this gives us an idea how that might happen. Basic semiosis, far from being unique to humans, primates, or other higher animals, appears to be coextensive with life. This helps us build a much-needed bridge between the arts and sciences. Throughout this course, I have tried to show that the literary arts are useful to the sciences, and the sciences are useful to the arts. The humanities have suffered, as much as the sciences have, from a wedge that has been driven between art and science, subjective and objective, mind and matter. The creative person has insight into the natural creativity of evolutionary processes and pattern formation. Creative writers like Nabokov may know better than scientists how truly radical new ideas can emerge in language as the result of some poetic interpretation. Artists tend to be aware of the way subconscious processes innovate, not through logical laws or relationships, but often through coincidences. Life uses language-like processes, and conversely, a poet can create radically new ideas using biosemiotic-like processes. The world is alive with meaning, and nature itself uses metaphor and metonymy in its creations. In organic processes, when things are coincidentally like each other, metaphoric, or coincidentally near each other, metonymic, this can constrain the way they interact and may affect the probabilities of certain causal outcomes. I believe such factors underlie what is called self-organization in nature, which is often described as purposeful. Nature truly is a self-creating work of art.